Hey guys and gals, and welcome back to Nerdium, the podcast where two grown men have chosen to take a break from our worldly responsibilities and take time to reminisce, reflect, and discuss all those things that truly make us the handsome nerds we are. Comics, TV, video games, or any topic that our pop culture-filled hearts desire. I'm your host, Cary, and joining me on my left is my co-host and fellow adventurer, Matt. And this week, we're taking a look at the genre that we feel gets forgotten sometimes. That beautiful genre, fantasy. But not only the genre, but possibly the decade that has done it best with such prolific contributors such as Jim Henson, Ridley Scott, and a few others. So strap on your chainmail, get your spellbooks ready, and join Matt and I as we talk about our favorite high fantasy. Matt, whenever you're ready, pour us out a flagon of mead and start that music.
Hey guys, welcome back to Nerdium. This week's episode is going to be all about 80's fantasy movies.
Love me some of that fantasy.
Yeah, those movies that kind of came out when we were young, kind of...
Well, I think the genre as a whole really kind of took off when we were super young. Like, I was born in 81, and that was like the start of, like, the fantasy run.
Yeah, and that was kind of like, I'd say probably the golden age of fantasy movies. Like, we got a lot of the iconic fantasy movies that came out during the 80s, and there haven't really been the same kind of quality of fantasy movies, I find anyways.
Well, there's a lot of like one-offs, like back in the 90s with what you would like 90s era special effects that were just horrible and campy. Like there was that Dungeons and Dragons movie with one of the Wayans brothers. There's been like a lot of attempts at like, and let's be clear, what we're talking about is like high fantasy. So like orcs and dragons, and I mean, superhero movies are fantasy and science fiction is fantasy, but what we're talking about is like fantasy. Like that good old school fantasy.
Yeah.
And it just seemed that the 80s were, like you said, was the huge peak of it all. I know, like I said, in the 90s, they tried to do it, but nothing's ever really captured. I don't know if maybe it's because the special effects got too good for the genre. Like, I think when we look back on the fantasy movies of the 80s, it's a lot of practical special effects, like your Jim Hensons, your Ray Harryhausens, all that sort of good stuff.
Mm-hmm. And I think also a lot of the 80s movies, they were, the 80s fantasy movies, they were made with no intention for like heavy merchandising or anything like that. But then the 90s, you get a lot of movies that you could tell that they made certain things just so that they could create the toys. And
yeah, well, and that's the funny thing too. Like in the 80s, a lot of our toys were specifically geared towards marketing. Like a lot of the cartoons that we watched. I mean, there's not too many cartoons. I mean, kind of now, but especially like I remember when I was a kid, like if you watched Saturday morning cartoons, you had the toys upstairs. Like
Ninja Turtles, Transformers, all that.
Yeah, all that sort of stuff. But the fantasy movies were really like, it was to really indulge that like Tolkien geek in all of us.
Yeah.
You know, stuff that, like you said, there were no real toys. I mean, I remember, I think Conan had some one-offs, if I'm remembering it correctly. But aside from that, you didn't really see a lot in the way of toys. I think the closest you get is the Dark Crystal compendium books or like graphic novels that kind of came out at that time. I don't recall too much else in the way of merchandise.
We all have our favorite, or at least handful of favorite 80s fantasy movies, even though they're kind of geared towards families, and even specifically some of them were geared towards children. Some of them were pretty dark.
Well, especially like the Jim Henson ones, like shockingly dark. I remember a few movies that I seen and thinking to myself, like they were well enough rated for a kid. Like I didn't really go to bed with a ton of nightmares. Yeah, but some of the themes, like some of the visuals, like looking back on what we would deem to be appropriate for kids now. And in the 80s, there was no rating system. I mean, you only had two kinds of movies, the movies for everybody or rated X. Yeah. And that was it. You didn't have the PG-13s, the adult accompaniment and all this jazz. It was just like, yeah, sure. Go for it. Yeah. You know, I remember being in the theater when I was 6 or 7 years old watching Beetlejuice when it was out. I mean, that is not a family movie.
All right, so let's get into some of the movies that kind of stand out to us. So you want to take the first kick at the can, or?
I'll take the first kick of the can, just coming off the topic of the darkness of some of the movies, and that's one of my personal favorites is The Dark Crystal.
That's a good pick.
I I remember seeing it when I was a kid, and it was really weird and it was really spooky, but you still had that good hero story element. Mm-hmm. It was one of Jim Henson's best movies as far as I'm concerned. 100% animatronic.
Yep.
There's really no actors, not that I can't remember any actors in that movie whatsoever outside of like the voice work for the puppets.
Yeah. Oh, there's the climbing scene where it was clearly a human rather than what's her name climbing the rocks. I remember that.
It's not Jen. It's
no, it's Jen.
Is it Jen? Yeah. Okay. But even then, just like the themes of the movie itself, like with the crystal shattering, and then suddenly the Skeksis and the Mystics show up. Like that was all like. If you were to just suddenly watch it expecting some sort of exposition as to how we got to that, you get like that narrator at the beginning, giving you the quick rundown of the Dark Crystal, and that's it.
Yeah.
That is it. You have no idea what's in the world. They just kind of keep throwing more and more stuff at you.
Yeah.
And that's why I said earlier, they initially released like a compendium to give you kind of more of a backstory. But hindsight being 2020, I don't think you always need a backstory. I think sometimes you can be dropped off in a world and just kind of accept the rules of the world as they're given to you.
Yeah, as long as the storytelling is good, then you don't really need to know the backstory to it.
Well, exactly. As long as if the movie has a set of rules and the movie follows the rules, and doesn't suddenly start to contradict itself, I think you're pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah, it was Jim Henson's first live-action feature film, so for it being the first one...
It was ambitious for his first one.
It was ambitious, and it actually did quite well.
Did it? I know. Oh, okay. It was another movie that we have on our list that actually flopped that became a cult classic.
Yeah.
But it was... I found later on in life, reading about it and learning more and more about it, I was stuff you don't really pick up when you were a kid. Like I remember reading that the Skeksis were all based off the 7 deadly sins.
Okay.
That's why there's only 7 of them. They all kind of represent visually they represent it. I know the one Skeksis that's really usurping everybody. He's clearly greed. Mm-hmm. There's avarice. There's gluttony. There's all kinds of stuff in there that I didn't realize when I was a kid. But then going back and watching it with some of the stuff that I learned later on, it actually really kind of drew some more lines together that I thought were fantastic.
Yeah, I haven't seen it in a long time, and it's been overdue for a rewatch, especially with the Netflix series coming out.
I was really surprised when I heard that. Like that one caught me so off guard when I saw that.
Same.
I remember it was on Twitter or a couple of like the websites that we go to visit, and all of a sudden I saw the Dark Crystal Netflix special. I'm like, oh, okay, they're putting the Dark Crystal on Netflix. That's lovely. I'll be sure to watch it. It's one of my favorite movies. Mm-hmm. And then it wasn't that at all. It was actually, we're doing a sequel to the Dark Crystal. I was like, here's my money. Just keep taking my money and give me my Dark Crystal sequel.
Is it a sequel or a series?
I don't know. I did a lot of reading, but at the time there wasn't a whole lot of information out there.
Yeah.
To me, if you look at the trailer on YouTube, it's clearly a Skeksis with like a robotic eye that suddenly turns around and stares at you.
Yeah.
So I don't know the way the Dark Crystal ends with the Skeksis and the Mystics coming together to form that weird alien race thing there. Mm-hmm. That kind of wraps up that role. There's no more Skeksis. The Skeksis was a byproduct of the Dark Crystal breaking. Spoiler alert. If you haven't seen it. I mean, it's 30 years old.
Yeah.
But it could be a prequel, like a series prequel. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like you said, the YouTube kind of teaser for it doesn't really give a whole lot away.
Not a lot. Everybody's staying pretty mum on it. Yeah. And I mean, I'm not disappointed. I'm not going out of my way to find leaks. Like I'm not.
Yeah.
I'd kind of like to walk into this cold and just see what's out there, what they present to us.
Yeah, certainly not one I would have pegged Netflix picking up at all.
No, it's a pretty bold move on their end because in our 80s list of movies that we all love, the Dark Crystal doesn't always come to the top of everybody's lists because of, some of the plot holes with the lack of exposition.
Yeah.
But also just, it's a dark movie. Like, it's not a nice movie by a long shot. No. It definitely has, like, the victorious end for the hero. But, it's really not a nice story. So I think it'll be... I think what Netflix is tapping in is those of us that now pay the bills and we have our responsibilities. And obviously we're the wallets. Now we're going back to our childhood and, feeding off of some of that nostalgia.
Yeah, I guess that could be it. The next one is another Jim Henson, Labyrinth.
See, I didn't like Labyrinth.
You didn't like Labyrinth?
Yeah. My sister loved Labyrinth. Maybe it was David Bowie in his onesie with his giant codpiece jumping around. Maybe it was the inclusion of a little bit more human act. It was a little bit brighter. It's still dark, but a little bit brighter. But
yeah,
I enjoy Labyrinth. I can watch Labyrinth and be like, yeah, that's it's a fun movie. But it's just not one that I ever really go out of my way to watch.
Yeah, whenever it's on TV, sometimes it's one of those ones that I'll put on and kind of watch in the background while I'm doing something. It's got some pretty good kind of tunes to it, though.
It does have some solid music. I can't say anything bad about the movie. It's just, it was never one that ever resonated well with me, but it's still a fantastic movie.
Mm-hmm. And for that reason, it's probably, as you alluded to, another Jim Henson movie that didn't do so well. Labyrinth was that movie.
But it's a movie that just, I mean, it's a cult phenomenon. There's no, box office wise, yeah, it flopped. And another list on our movie, it definitely flopped in the state and in North America, but it's still just such a huge cult movie.
Mm-hmm.
And the music. I mean, it is a quintessentially 80s movie between the music, the costumes, the animatronics. I mean, it just screams 80s from the get go. But it is a fun watch.
Oh, yeah. Like Bowie does a really good. Was he a Demon King?
He's the Troll King.
Troll King. That's what it was. Yeah, he pulls off a pretty good Troll King, even though it doesn't look like a troll at all.
Well, it's weird. There's a fan theory out there because he takes the protagonist's baby brother.
Okay.
And that's kind of what sends her into the labyrinth, because she wishes her baby brother's kind of GTFO, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a fan theory out there that says that David Bowie was taken by another Troll King when he was a baby.
Okay.
And it's kind of like this cyclical sort of thing where his time's almost up, so now he's got to find somebody else to take over the throne. And I forget the context of it because it's been ages since I've really sat down to watch it. But basically, he doesn't understand why the sister is so adamant on getting him back. Like, suddenly the sister has buyer's remorse when, I hate my baby brother, get rid of him. All of a sudden the baby brother's gone and she panics. She's got to chase him down. Mm-hmm. The dynamic between him and her is that he just he doesn't understand why she's after him, because when he was taken, no one came looking for him.
Yeah.
There's a couple of really good YouTube videos there on that particular theory, but that was one I found like snooping around that I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Like a possibility why Bowie didn't look like any of the other trolls.
Yeah, I remember seeing that theory. I can't remember. I thought maybe there was actually some fiction on that where there was a story written about it.
I think the YouTube channel I was watching was, I think she's called Fangirl. I think she does like stop motion, a lot of the stop motion animation that a lot of YouTubers do. Okay. But that was where I heard that theory.
All right.
It was an interesting theory. Like I was genuinely intrigued by it. So
yeah, it adds a little kind of subtext to the character bit. So
well, exactly. I thought that was pretty cool. And again, it is a solid movie with solid music. Yeah,
but I do find that some parts of the movie kind of get derailed and kind of stop dead in its tracks, but
a lot of Jim Henson movies, and especially with a lot of movies like these, I mean, it's a lot of just throwing everything. The whole world gets thrown at you one after another. It's, oh, look at this, and oh, look at that, and oh, this too, and yeah, it can get pretty convoluted for an hour and a half, 2 hour long movie.
Yeah, but again, Jim Henson does really awesome puppets and animatronics and all that. Like, creates like a very realistic world that we don't get that necessarily anymore with the CG crap that.
I know we're slowly moving back away from the CG stuff, because Jim Henson Studios, there's no shortage of work for them.
Yeah,
they got their hands in all kinds of good stuff, but you're right. In the 80s, it's just without there being a CG, you had to do something, and Jim Henson Studios were the ones that did it the best. There was a couple, but Jim Henson blew them all out of the water.
Mm-hmm. Like I remember one of our first episodes, we were talking about how some of the best kind of cult classic movies had that kind of tangible kind of feel to it, and with those puppets and animatronics, like, you really got that.
Well, exactly. Plus the actors had something to work off of, right? Yeah. Like there wasn't a man in a bubble suit in front of them. They weren't talking to a stick with a golf ball on top of it. They were literally talking to the creature that you see them talking to on film.
Mm-hmm. And was it Jennifer Connelly's first movie, or think it was one of her first.
Yeah. I mean, it wouldn't be much higher than the first.
Yeah, she's pretty young in that one.
Yeah, she's not... Maybe she had something else. I think she did a couple of commercials before that.
Yeah.
But that's about it. That was, like I said, if not her first, then got to be close somewhere around there.
But yeah, in the 80s, like, we definitely did have the kind of cool effects with the animatronics. Like, we had Clash of the Titans. It was the stop motion stuff.
Yeah, all the Ray Harryhausen stuff.
Yeah, he did a good job with it too. So those are kind of the two names that kind of jump out with 80s special effects.
Yeah,
sure.
Which is weird because I thought Clash of the Titans was released a lot earlier than the 80s. When I was kind of like looking at my notes for this episode, I was shocked to see just how close or just how, I'm going to hesitate in saying new for a 30-year-old movie. I thought it was made in like the 60s, 70s.
I think there was maybe one made before that.
There was one, it wasn't Zora the Greek, it was something else, but maybe there was an older one. I know Ray Harryhausen worked on that one as well.
Oh yeah?
Because that was one where I was, I'm going to, quote unquote, forced to watch it. It was one of the ones where I was specifically sat down, so you're going to watch this movie, you're going to love this movie. Like, oh, okay, sounds good to me.
Yeah, so what else made your list?
Probably the very, very top of my list, the number one where I can't even scroll through it on TV without stopping to watch it, is The Never-Ending Story. I can't get away from it. I try. I don't know what it is about this movie. I've loved it since I was a kid. I will shackle my child to a chair and Clockwork Orange him into watching the whole thing at one point in time. It's just probably one of my most favorite movies of all times.
Yeah, as soon as you see it, you kind of almost get sucked into it, kind of like a swamp.
Instantly. I mean, and it's not as dark as The Dark Crystal. It's
got its points.
It has a couple of really miserable moments in the story. It has some, for a kids movie, some really sad moments. But it also has some really fantastic fantasy to it. Mm-hmm. Again, the soundtrack is quintessentially 80s. A lot of the synthesized keyboard action.
Yeah.
And it was one of the first movies I can remember with a lot of like weird pop culture references. Yeah. In the throne room, if you freeze frame it, and I never did this, so again, the YouTube and the Googles kind of helped out with this. But in the princess's throne room, you have E.T., Gumby, Ewoks, Yoda, Mickey Mouse, and a couple of others that I can't quite piece together, and I just couldn't spend a little bit more time looking through it. But if you freeze frame it, they zoom in. There's a couple of videos where they'll zoom in and show you all the individual characters. And sure enough, I took a snapshot of the scene, and they're all in there.
Jesus.
Yeah, it was really, really... I never noticed it because why the hell would I? When I was a kid, why would I be looking at that? And yeah, they're all there.
Yeah, it's like the Ready Player Ones of fantasy.
Pretty much one of the first ones of fantasy, to be sure, yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's because it's an imaginary world, so...
Well, I think the idea of Fantasia is that it's all of our dreams when we're kids.
Yeah.
Like the idea of Fantasia being attacked by the nothingness, it's kind of an analog, to just kind of what happens to you as you grow up. You stop living in that fantasy world. You start losing your connection with all these weird little characters and things that really kind of drive you forward. Unless you're cool geeks like us, in which case you drag that into adulthood with you kicking and screaming, much to all of our partners' delights.
Yeah, that's not going away.
No. They chose us. They could have said no. They had their opportunities.
No, it's a great movie, like, because it doesn't really fall on any of the pre-fantasy tropes or anything. Like, it's got its elves and trolls and all that, but it doesn't really kind of...
It's all the other weird stuff it just kind of throws in there, like the snail racer, the rock eater.
Yeah. Just
weird fantasy characters that you wouldn't typically see in a more Tolkien-esque sort of story. Mm-hmm. Trolls, elves, dwarves, they're all there.
Yeah.
But then there's just all this other weird, crazy stuff going on that really kind of makes it stand on its own.
Yeah.
And for the movie that it was in North America, it bombed. It bombed in a huge way. I think it was made for like, let's say 60 million. I'm rounding that figure right down. But I think it only cleared 20 million in North America. In Germany, was a huge hit. Yeah. Huge hit. Because the author of the story, who, fun side note, hated the movie, it was a German story before it became a North American movie.
Yeah, no, surprisingly for how it was received in the box office, it's still got a big cult following, and fans still love it. Like, you get references to Luck Dragons all the time, and
constantly, absolutely. But then, like, the other thing I think in the 80s, maybe this is just me, maybe it's just the area that I was in. Like, going to the movies wasn't the commonality it kind of is nowadays, if that makes sense. Like, I find people are a lot more inclined to go to the movies. Or people seem to spend a lot more time in movie theaters.
Yeah.
I think they've gotten a lot bigger. They house a lot more people. Like I say, it could just be the area that I'm in. Going to the movies was like a once-in-a-blue moon thing. Like, even in the summertime with all the big blockbusters, it was just like, maybe, who knows?
Yeah. Also, back then, they weren't pumping out, like, as many movies as they are these days, where you get, like, 8 superhero movies in 1 year.
Yeah, the mill wasn't churning them out the way that they do nowadays.
Yeah.
Like, you had movies in the summertime. I think you had, movies come Christmas time, but that was about, you didn't have a new movie every single Friday to go peep around in.
Yeah. And I remember, like, it taking a long time for it to come out on video after it was in the theater.
Yeah, one, it wasn't digital.
Yeah.
They had to translate everything off the reel to reel and then put it on cassette, make the cassette tapes, ship out the cassette tapes. Like, nowadays, just like on our PlayStation, on our Xbox, we just download the movie.
Yep.
And that's it. That's all you need to do. You don't necessarily have a physical medium that you have to deal with anymore. Mm-hmm. Just like our video games and a lot of other things, you don't need to do anything. The studio can just be like, all right, here's the file. Yeah. Release it publicly behind a paywall. They're good to go.
Yeah. Yeah, back to Neverending Story. No, it was like, I thought it was a great movie. The acting in it was pretty good. Like, you got Atreyu. He's able to convey a lot of emotion on screen. Like, he's believable when his horse is getting sucked into the swamp. Yeah. You feel it.
Apparently, I think it was him and the director really didn't get along. The director really didn't care for him. Don't know why. He said he was a real little prick.
Oh, well. Yeah.
Well, okay, fine, cool, but his acting was believable. Like, I remember as a kid getting quite upset when the horse drowns in the Swamp of Sorrows.
Yeah.
Like, that, again, that was one of those moments where I'm just like, man, this is a kid's movie. Yeah. Like, just so we are clear, it's a kid's movie.
But then you watch it as an adult, and you're like, why would you take your horse into the Swamp of Sorrows?
Well, it is
as advertised.
It is. Yeah, you can't be disappointed. Yeah. And they make it clear, you just have to have sorrow in your heart. That horse just has to be upset that he didn't get to eat his whole apple, and that's enough to sink into the muck. Yeah. So
it's the horse's fault.
Yeah, well, I mean, not far be it me to victim blame, but I mean, could have been a little bit more positive about the situation, I think.
Yeah, cheer up, horse.
Yeah.
It was, the first movie was great. The second movie,
the second movie was rough, but that's because the second movie was done so far after.
Yeah. You
couldn't have the same actors.
No. The
story, I think the book itself, the movie covers like the first half of the book.
Okay.
And then the second part was supposed to cover the second half, but it really didn't mingle well.
No.
I remember seeing it as a kid, and I'm like, yeah, okay, that was fun. If I see the Neverending Story 2 on TV, if I got nothing else going on, I'll give it a watch.
Yeah.
But I'm not stopping dead in my tracks like I do for the original.
Yeah. It's definitely got a different feel to it. I think it was made in the 90s, wasn't it?
Early 90s. Yeah. Super early 90s. I'm going to say 1990. Maybe 89 and then released on video in 90. But I wasn't super young, but I wasn't a teenager yet, that's for sure.
Neverending Story 2 was made in 1990. Thank you, Google.
No, the Google box never lies.
Yes.
So
it's 6 years after the original.
Yeah. It's kind of hard. I mean, nowadays we look at the sequels that like a 3-year wait for a sequel is a super long time. Mm-hmm. But back in the 80s and 90s, 6 years seems good. It's just, it didn't really jive all that well. It just,
no.
They tried to throw a lot of the old characters in there. They didn't, I remember the Rock Eater, suddenly he had a kid. And they were really trying to like show where these characters have been and what they've been up to. And Like, My only takeaway from number 2 was that they had to row across a lake of acid, I think, and then the rock eater with his son. Those are like the only 2 things that stand out for that whole entire movie for me. I couldn't tell you what the plot is. Maybe I think it's Bastian that actually goes to Fantasia. It's not Atreyu. That's it.
Yeah, I think Bastian does go.
Yeah, it's just not, for me, it's just not that memorable.
I think Atreyu's there. I think I recall.
Yeah, I think he meets them. I think the whole impetus is near the end of the first movie, where you see Bastian flying around on the luck dragon, having a little bit of revenge against the bullies.
Yeah.
I think that translates to him making his way into Fantasia. But again,
All I can remember from making reference to that scene is the Family Guy reference to the scene.
Yeah! No, that's like the end of Neverending Story.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of transitions to number 2, where he goes to Fantasia.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah, no, like it just kind of, I don't know, they seem to have captured lightning in the bottle with that one, and then not so much with the second one.
There was also a Neverending Story 3.
I remember hearing about that.
And I want to say it was like a TV series or some darn thing. I've never seen it because I don't hate my life. So I don't want to see some of my favorite things spoiled. But there was also an animated one where in the book, Atreyu has green skin and blue hair. In the animated series, he has green skin and blue hair. That was that's my only takeaway from that. I don't remember spending too much time on that at all.
Yeah. Well, so Neverending Story 2, I remember Bastian was played by Jonathan Brandis, which you later see in like the was it Seagate DSV series?
I can't remember.
Young childhood actor. I believe he committed suicide recently. He was 27 when he died.
Oh, okay.
And then you got John Wesley Shipp, the Flash, playing his father. Do you remember that?
No, not at all. That is how memorable number 2 was for it. I just draw a blank. Like, I know that there are certain plot points that I really should stick out, but I can't remember any of them. I can't remember what the problem was in number 2 that they were fighting, if it was still the Nothing, or I can't remember what they were going up against.
I think there was like a witch or something. I don't remember.
Sure.
I remember she had like the weird black crab people thing.
That's right. There was weird black crab people things in the Dark Crystal too.
Yeah.
A lot of weird black crab people in fantasy movies.
Yeah, and then I'm looking up the Neverending Story 3 just because I don't think I've seen it. But apparently it's got Jason James Richter in it that plays Bastian, and he's the kid from Free Willy.
Oh, yeah?
And you even get, like, Jack Black's in the movie.
Yeah, doesn't he play the bully?
I guess.
Doesn't he? I think he's the bully. That I remember the scene where he's got, like, this wicked unibrow, shaved head. He's just a unpleasant feast for the eyes.
Yeah, you're right. He does have a unibrow.
So, like, I've seen snippets of it. I think, like you said, Lightning in the Bottle was the very, very first one. I think if you only see the first one, I don't think you're losing out on anything. Like, it's follow up with number 2 and I guess number 3. But I think number 1 is pretty much, if you could tie it up in a bow and be quite content with yourself.
Yeah. All right. So, next one I'm going to go with is Legend.
It's been so long since I've seen Legend. But everywhere I look, there's always like that Tim Curry gif as the devil. Yeah.
Yeah, he goes from like It to like Home Alone to, well, Legend's still before Home Alone 2, but...
He had a lot of weird movies.
He had some...
That's some really weird...
80s he did like a lot of really weird ones. He did like the It, the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and...
Legend. Yeah, no, wasn't the unicorn? Aren't they saving a unicorn in Legend?
Yep, that's it.
There you go.
So, I like Legend just because it's during the awesome time of Ridley Scott. Ridley Scott's doing some of his best stuff then.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, you got the Blade Runner, you got the Alien movies, all those kind of movies, and Legend kind of captures some of that kind of feel and that kind of dark grit that he puts in the other movies.
Yep.
Kind of pulls it into a fantasy movie, which you don't really... Fantasy movies, they can be dark, but you don't really necessarily get that same kind of Blade Runner grit sometimes, where it's like kind of the character development. All that. So you actually get Tom Cruise in one of his, I think, first fantasy movies, I think. Yeah. Other than... I'm not counting Interview with the Vampire, but like...
No, I think it's fair to say, like, Tom Cruise in Legend was super duper young.
Yeah.
Like, this is like way before Top Gun. This is way before any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And he's young. He's playing the character Jack. It's been a while since I saw that movie too, but I think Jack's a human that's got like elf friends. Sure.
Why not? Just as good as any other fantasy movie.
Yeah. And so the whole premise of the movie is he's trying to, him and Mia Sara, they're trying to protect the last unicorn from the darkness. The darkness, it looks kind of pretty much like the devil. He's trying to kill the last unicorn to create a world of eternal night.
Yeah, isn't the impetus that there's nothing as innocent as a unicorn, so he's just got to take out that last unicorn as like the analog of the loss of innocence and all that jazz?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. And I think the movie even opens up with the second last unicorn being slaughtered. So
yeah, there's a lot of fantasy movies, particularly in the 80s, really revolve around an opening of a death scene. Like, here you go, stab, 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 stab. Yeah. Let's get the movie started.
Well, it's almost like Blade Runner, where Ridley Scott opens the movie with a scene that sets the tone for the rest of the movie. Like in Blade Runner, he kind of shows the synths, kind of, what do they call them in...
Oh, I had the word right at the tip of my tongue too. Replicant.
Yeah, so he opens with the replicants kind of, and it sets the tone of what you can kind of expect with the replicants, and then he introduces the protagonist.
Yeah.
So he kind of like stages the world. So he kind of does that with this movie too, I find.
Yeah, no, it's another, like you said, it's Ridley Scott. Would you say it at its finest? I mean, the whole Ridley Scott in the 80s is really, like, that whole run for him was solid for, fantasy in like the high fantasy sense of like Legend, but just like the fantasy science fiction world that he created. Didn't he also do The Abyss?
He did.
Yeah. So there was that. There was The Alien. Like, just solid movies, and all of them, the exception of The Abyss, I think, with a really solid physical medium for special effects.
And yeah, like Tim Curry's makeup for that movie is unreal. Like, he looks pretty cool.
For the longest time, I had no idea it was Tim Curry. And I'd watched like it, and I had watched Rocky Horror Picture Show when I was pretty young. And I remember watching Legend, and it's like, yeah, it's the devil. Sure looks like a devil.
Yeah.
Not even guessing that it was Tim Curry. I mean, in the long run, when you look back, Tim Curry's kind of got that voice that stands out.
Yeah.
But at the time, at first glance, without even hearing the voice, just seeing what it was coming out of, it never dawned on me that it was him. Like, that's how good that makeup is.
Yeah. No, like, you have to look pretty close to tell it's Tim Curry. It's the voice that gives it away, but you still have to look pretty close.
I mean, that being said, there's a lot of prostheses on his face that kind of misshape it to like another degree.
Yeah.
But all in all, like, just the performance is good. I mean, if anybody was to think of the devil, I think if you were to show them a picture of Tim Curry playing the whatever he's called in that movie, that's what they're thinking of.
It was just called The Darkness.
The Darkness.
Sorry to correct ourselves there. The Abyss was actually James Cameron.
James Cameron.
I get those mixed up.
In the back of my head, I'm just like, maybe it was James Cameron.
Yeah.
But I'm just going to keep talking anyway.
Just going to keep running with it. Completely forgot what I was going to say. And it was also, like, you got some good acting from Tom Cruise. He kind of was good playing those impish kind of roles back in the 80s. Like, before he started kind of taking on other kind of different roles. Like, he's able to kind of play that character pretty well.
Well, it's because he's a little impish himself. I mean, he's only like 5'0" or however short he is.
Yeah. Well, did you know that he lived in Ottawa for a while?
I didn't.
Yeah.
I didn't. I wouldn't have noticed.
Yeah. He lives
Just too tall for that.
We weren't here for that. He lived in Ottawa when he was a kid.
Oh, well, there you go.
Went to school and stuff in Ottawa, so.
Good to know.
Yeah. I wasn't in Ottawa then.
No, neither was I. I was very much somewhere else.
What's your next pick?
Oh, we might as well talk about probably one of my favorite movies to watch just once in a while is Conan.
Conan?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just the original Conan. Not necessarily the sequel where it really got into the fantasy, but just like the original Conan the Barbarian.
Mm-hmm.
I know my girlfriend can watch it simply because Arnold doesn't say much of anything, except for like just grunt and growl and suffer when he's getting hurt.
Yeah.
But still like solid like barbarian-esque fantasy. I mean, it's in the title, but like an excellent job by James Earl Jones, who plays the antagonizing barbarian there, capturing Arnold when he's a kid to enslave him, and of course like every great 80s movie, there's a lovely montage of him pushing, I don't know if it was a wheat mill or whatever. This kid slowly just turns into the monster that was Arnold Schwarzenegger at the peak of his size.
Yeah. Yeah, he is a monster in that movie.
That was like, I mean, that was like the run of Arnold being Arnold.
Yeah.
You know, the 80s were like some of the, and I use this term loosely, best Arnold performances that you can find as far as performances go.
Yeah.
But like that was when he was in his biggest and most solid, like, it's an impressive figure that man cuts on screen.
Yeah. And it was also kind of like, his English wasn't super great back then, so it wasn't one of the more talkative movies he had. No, and it really benefits if you can't. I know a lot of people a lot of friends of mine don't like Arnold Schwarzenegger. They just can't stand his acting. He's a garbage actor. Blah 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 blah. I mean, he's bad. He's good bad. Yeah. But I've seen certain movies of him, like really really old movies, like Tarzan. I think it's Tarzan Comes to New York. Whatever his like first breakout movie was, it's rough to listen to. Like that man is new to the land. Yeah. But no, it's a great movie. It's not a movie necessarily for its level of acting. It's a good barbarian story, but
sometimes if you just want to watch, it's one of those movies where. And we can do this now with certain movies that are out. If you just want to go watch loud noises and swords being swung at each other and occasional screams with blood on the screen, it's a good movie for that. Yeah. Like you said, it's just a barbarian. It's just barbarians beating the piss out of each other. Like, yeah. It is what it is, man. It's just a cheap and easy thrill. Kick back, put your feet up, turn off for a minute, watch the movie, and then move along.
Yeah. If you have a hard time visualizing Arnold Schwarzenegger knocking out a horse, you can watch this movie.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot about the horse. Sometimes you got to punch your horse. I get it. Like I get it. But no, it's just a weird. I know, like when we did our review for Pacific Rim Uprising, like it's not a movie you're going to for heavy plot, heavy acting, great special effects. Yeah, like you're just going to watch a man in a wool loincloth just beat the shit out of everybody. It's an Arnold Schwarzenegger 80s movie. Yeah. You know, like it's like in Commando where it's just him and a machine gun versus an army.
A machine gun with unlimited bullets.
The machine gun of infinite bullets. That's right. Yeah. Like it's that movie, you know, only this time instead of a machine gun, he's swinging around a giant broadsword. Yep.
Well, I think that's going to probably wrap up our... Do you have anything else?
No, there's just... In the 80s with fantasy, man, there's just way too much stuff to go through. Like
there is.
There's good stuff, there's bad stuff. I think we, like... Our top picks kind of cover them with the Dark Crystal, Labyrinth, Neverending Story. There's lots of other movies that we didn't really touch on that we could have gotten into as well. Mm-hmm. And like we said, that's just like the high fantasy sort of aspect of it, man. You could branch out into a more like science fiction fantasy for the 80s. Yeah. Like if you like movies with like a good solid physical medium, excellent puppetry, like the 80s fantasy movies for me is where it was. Mm-hmm. The 90s where we suddenly tried to do everything with computer generated special effects is a write-off in film history as far as I'm concerned. because you just lost that natural feel. And that's not to say that some of these creatures that we see in these movies look natural by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah.
Jen in The Dark Crystal just looks weird.
Yeah.
But, that's just like a one-off. It's not always going to be perfect.
No.
But it's everything else around it. It's the worlds that these creatures inhabit. The worlds look real. The creatures look real. It's just really fun.
Yeah.
And even though they get ridiculously dark, I think all fantasy kind of has its foot in one foot in one realm and one foot in the other. And that's the light and the dark balancing out. You can't have a good fantasy quest without some sort of darkness.
Yeah. And sometimes the fantasy movie literally calls the antagonist the darkness.
Or the nothing. It's typically like, it's always the dark versus the light. It's, you want to use the Star Wars reference of the Sith versus the Jedi, good versus evil. Like, it's always that.
Yeah.
And they don't shy away from tragedy, but it's typically, and I can't think of anything that has a negative ending. It's typically a pretty good heroic ending. Like,
yeah.
There's usually some sort of redemption, some denouement at the end of the movie to at least make it say, it was all worth it in the end.
Yeah. And we could literally talk about this for 2 hours. It could be like a 3-part series almost, because there is so much and it does branch off. And we could get like the Highlander that's almost straddling sci-fi and fantasy. Like, I think the initial Highlander is more fantasy, but then it kind of starts going the sci-fi direction in the later ones. We also didn't even really kind of talk about Willow, which is almost like Legend with Val Kilmer, directed by Ron Howard, all that. So you get some of the kind of big names of the 80s doing their big fantasy movies at that time, and in a really kind of organic and tangible medium.
That and we talk about fantasy, like we just kind of talked about fantasy as in just like the movie medium. Mm-hmm. You could branch out from that and talk about the illustrative medium. You could talk about the written medium with books. Mm-hmm. There is no shortage of literature to look at, and you say, I want to read a story about goblins and orcs beating the piss out of a hero. Walk into any bookstore and then just go to the fantasy section and see what's there.
Yep.
Like, it is not a genre that has slim pickings to choose from. Like, you can get really, really involved in it, or you can just kind of sample a little bit of it, right? Like, most people love Skyrim as a game. Mm-hmm. If you're dealing with Elder Scrolls, Skyrim, all that stuff, there's your high fantasy right there.
Yeah. And also the 80s is kind of when Dungeons and Dragons were really taking off. So
well, exactly. So you had this whole like cultural revolution in the 80s where fantasy was what it was, man. If you wanted to escape for a little while, you were probably going down the fantasy road. Mm-hmm. I know when I was growing up, only the real geeky, nerdy kids liked that kind of fantasy. The cool, geeky nerds, you stuck to like the Star Wars-esque kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I never shied away from it, man. I really enjoy the fantasy just as much as I enjoy the sci-fi. And sometimes I really prefer fantasy over the sci-fi. Like, it's nice for a change when, instead of pew-pewing all over the place, you're watching swords smash into each other.
Exactly. Well, that's going to wrap up this week's episode. If we didn't talk about your favorite 80s fantasy movie, feel free to let us know. We'd like to hear from you. Absolutely. If there's something that we missed or you want to have a say in the conversation, feel free to send us a message. Yeah, hit us up on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or just send us an email at nerdiumpodcast@gmail.com. And yeah, we would love to have a discussion with you about your favorite fantasy movies. Yeah, and a big shout out to all the people that started following us. I guess we're up over 1,000 followers on Twitter. Yeah, almost 1,100 now. Oh God, we are becoming influential. Yeah, we're big names. in that little pond that is the podcast world. Yeah, Canadian podcast world. Baby. Anyways, have a good one, and we'll talk to you guys next week. Take care, everybody. Bye.